Most people think the risk in first time jet ownership comes from choosing the wrong aircraft or underestimating the costs. But in many cases, that isn't where the real exposure sits. The greater risk appears later, not because anything failed, but because a decision that once made perfect sense slowly becomes difficult to revisit. And by the time anyone realizes that optionality has narrowed, life has already reorganized itself around ownership. This video stays at that level, not the aircraft themselves, but how the decision behaves over time. Because for many first time owners, the risk isn't that the choice was wrong, it's that a good choice quietly becomes hard to change. When I talk about optionality in this context, I'm not talking about freedom in an abstract sense or the ability to walk away in theory. I'm talking about something more practical. Optionality is the ability to pause, restructure, downsize, or meaningfully reconsider without triggering disruption across work, family, and relationships. In the early stages of ownership, it feels as if all these options remain available, but over time, the decision stops behaving like a purchase and starts behaving like infrastructure. It holds routines in place, it shapes schedules and expectations. Other parts of life begin to depend on it. And when that happens, the question is no longer, is this still the best structure for us? The question quietly becomes, what would we have to unwind if we made a different decision? That shift from asset to anchor is where true irreversibility begins, and it rarely happens all at once. It builds gradually through reasonable choices that made complete sense at the time. What I want to do here is stay at the level of how decisions behave over time, because most of the risk in first time ownership doesn't come from choosing the wrong jet, but from how life slowly reorganizes itself around a decision that initially fit perfectly well. These patterns don't appear as mistakes, they appear as progress. They arrive through improvements in comfort, reliability, time protection, and control. And because they feel positive, they rarely trigger caution while they're forming. Let me walk through four of the most common ones. At the beginning, the aircraft is introduced as a tool, a way to reduce friction, protect time, and simplify travel when it makes sense. But very quickly, what starts as an upgrade in specific situations becomes the way we travel now. Trips that once involved trade offs start to feel automatic. Family, team, and close relationships adapt around that new baseline. None of this feels extravagant. It feels efficient, feels appropriate, it feels aligned with the stage of life you're in. But once ownership moves from useful to normal, any reduction in size, hours, or frequency no longer feels like a neutral adjustment. It feels like going backwards. And the more people who depend on that new normal, even indirectly, the more expensive that step back becomes, socially and personally, not just financially. This is where optionality begins to shrink. This pattern is operational, not emotional. Once ownership is in place, the organization naturally reorganizes around it. Travel planning changes, scheduling changes, expectations change, responsibilities shift. Over time, the aircraft becomes part of how work gets done. That creates a quiet dependency, not because ownership was oversold, but because people optimize around whatever system removes the most friction. The challenge appears later. When someone asks whether ownership is still the right structure, the discussion is no longer about the aircraft alone. It is about workflows, convenience, reliability, and the disruption that change would create. By that point, exiting ownership doesn't just mean selling an asset. It means unpicking a system that people have already built their work around. And that makes reconsideration significantly harder, even when rational. This one develops slowly. Over time, the aircraft stops being a travel solution and becomes part of how responsibility, stability, and leadership is expressed. For some people, it signals continuity. For others, professionalism. For others, success at a certain level of operation. There's nothing wrong with that, but once ownership connects, even slightly, to identity or public perception, Downsizing, pausing, or restructuring no longer reads as a practical optimization. It reads as a shift in position. And because high performing people do not like decisions to be interpreted that way, the idea of reconsidering ownership becomes less discussable, not impossible, just less available as an option. And when a decision becomes difficult to even talk about, it has already begun to move toward irreversibility. This one's the quietest. Early on, the question being asked is ownership still the right structure for us? But over time, the question shifts to how do we demonstrate that ownership makes sense? Data and utilization no longer test the decision, they protect it. Everyone involved becomes slightly more invested in showing that the path is working, not out of ego, out of responsibility. But once a decision needs to be defended, it becomes much harder to revisit honestly. And by that stage, optionality has already narrowed in practice, even if on paper alternatives remain. These situations are hard to see in the moment because they don't arrive as issues, they arrive as improvements. Travel becomes smoother, time is better protected, the people around you are happier with how things now work. In environments where reliability and control truly matter, all of this feels like progress. Momentum feels like validation. Ownership doesn't feel risky, it feels correct. And nothing about that experience suggests that flexibility is shrinking, because from the inside, it doesn't feel like dependence is forming. It feels like life is becoming more functional and more consistent with the level at which you now operate, which may also be true. The difficulty is that by the time someone asks, is this still the right structure for us? The question lands inside years of routines, expectations, and relationships that have already grown around the decision. And from that point on, the risk stops being financial and becomes structural. From the outside, jet ownership is often analyzed in terms of numbers, but in many first time ownership journeys, the most significant cost doesn't show up in financial terms. It shows up in how difficult it becomes to make a different decision later. The aircraft may still be flying well, the trips may still be useful, the experience may still feel positive, but beneath that, the decision has begun to behave like infrastructure. It anchors routines, it holds expectations in place. Other parts of life and work now depend on it. And once ownership reaches that point, even small adjustments, downsizing, pausing, or restructuring no longer feel like logistical changes. They feel like changes in stability, which is why many people remain on a path that no longer fits quite as cleanly as it once did. Not because they cannot afford to leave, but because leaving requires unwinding a system that has already grown around the decision. That is what loss of optionality really looks like. Not failure, not regret, just a gradual shift from we chose this because it worked for us to we continue because everything now relies on it. And once a decision reaches that point, the hardest and most important question becomes harder to ask. Is this still the right structure for the life we are actually living now?